The king who wrote the first law, Hammurabi of Babylon. What if I told you one man wrote the first laws of civilization, not with pen and paper, but with a chisel and stone? Over 3,700 years ago, King Hammurabi laid the foundation for justice, order, and society as we know it. If ancient codes, epic power plays, and eye for an eye justice fascinate you, hit that subscribe button now, because UTAK Diaries is about to bring the ancient courtroom to life. Picture this. The year is 1750 BCE, and the ancient world is a chaotic tapestry of warring city-states, tribal conflicts, and lawless territories where might makes right. In the heart of Mesopotamia, between the life-giving waters of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, stands the magnificent city of Babylon. Its towering ziggurats pierce the sky, its bustling markets overflow with merchants from distant lands, and at its center sits a throne occupied by one of history's most revolutionary rulers. This is Hammurabi, the sixth king of the first Babylonian dynasty, and he's about to change the course of human civilization forever. But Hammurabi wasn't born into greatness. When he ascended to the throne around 1792 BC, Babylon was just another city-state in a region dominated by more powerful neighbors. The mighty kingdom of Assyria loomed to the north, while the Elamites threatened from the east. To the south, the ancient Sumerian cities still held considerable influence, and rival kingdoms like Mari and Eshnaana controlled crucial trade routes. Young Hammurabi inherited a kingdom that was barely holding its own in this complex web of ancient geopolitics. What set Hammurabi apart wasn't just his military prowess, though he would prove to be a formidable conqueror. It wasn't merely his diplomatic skills, though he would masterfully play his enemies against each other. What truly distinguished this ancient king was his revolutionary understanding. Lasting power couldn't be built on the sword alone. It required something far more sophisticated, a system of laws that would govern not just his subjects, but future generations across the known world. The ancient world before Hammurabi operated on a simple principle: the strong ruled the weak, and justice was whatever the local strongman decided it should be. Disputes were settled through trial by combat, divine ordeal, or the arbitrary whims of whoever held power at the moment. Merchants traveling between cities never knew what rules would govern their transactions. Farmers couldn't be certain their property rights would be respected. Women had no legal protections, and slaves existed entirely at their master's mercy. It was a world where uncertainty bred chaos, and chaos bred more violence. Hammurabi recognized that this system was not just morally problematic, but practically unsustainable. How could trade flourish when merchants couldn't predict the legal consequences of their actions? How could agriculture develop when property rights were uncertain? How could society advance when every dispute potentially led to blood feuds that could last generations? The young king understood that true power lay not in ruling through fear, but in creating a system so fair and predictable that people would willingly submit to it. The creation of Hammurabi's Code wasn't a sudden inspiration, but the culmination of decades of careful observation, consultation, and refinement. The king didn't work in isolation. He consulted with priests who understood the religious traditions that governed daily life, merchants who knew the practical needs of commerce, and administrators who dealt with the endless stream of disputes that came before the royal court. He studied the existing legal traditions of the Sumerians, whose civilization had already produced sophisticated legal concepts, and he examined the customs of the various peoples who had come under Babylonian rule. What emerged from this process was nothing short of revolutionary. The Code of Hammurabi contained 282 laws, covering everything from property rights and commercial transactions to family relationships and criminal justice. But more importantly, It established principles that would echo through the millennia. The idea that laws should be written down and publicly displayed, that justice should be predictable and consistent, and that even kings should be bound by legal principles. The physical creation of the code was as impressive as its content. Hammurabi ordered his laws to be carved into a massive black stone stele, nearly 8 feet tall and crafted from diorite, one of the hardest stones known to ancient craftsmen. At the top of the stele, a relief carving showed Hammurabi receiving the laws directly from Shamash, the Babylonian god of justice. This wasn't mere decoration, it was a powerful political statement. By depicting himself as the recipient of divine law, Hammurabi was claiming that his code wasn't just royal decree, but sacred commandment. The laws themselves reveal a sophisticated understanding of human nature and social dynamics. Take, for example, the famous principle of proportional justice. If a man destroys the eye of another man, they shall destroy his eye. This wasn't primitive vengeance, as it's often portrayed today. It was actually a revolutionary limitation on revenge. Before Hammurabi, someone who lost an eye might kill their attacker's entire family in retaliation. The eye for an eye principle established that punishment should fit the crime, no more and no less. But Hammurabi's code went far beyond simple retribution. It established complex regulations for commercial transactions, including interest rates, contract enforcement, and liability for damages. It created detailed provisions for family law, including marriage contracts, divorce procedures, and inheritance rights. It even addressed what we might today call consumer protection, establishing standards for construction quality and professional services. A builder whose house collapsed and killed the owner would face execution, while a surgeon who caused a patient's death through negligence would have his hands cut off. The code also revealed the social stratifications of ancient Babylon, with different punishments for crimes committed against nobles, commoners, and slaves. While this seems unjust by modern standards, it actually represented progress for its time. Before Hammurabi, there were often no legal protections at all for lower classes. The code at least established that even slaves had some rights and that crimes against them would be punished, even if less severely than crimes against the nobility. Perhaps most remarkably, Hammurabi's code included numerous protections for women and children that were extraordinarily progressive for the ancient world. Women could own property, engage in business, and even divorce their husbands under certain circumstances. Widows were protected from being cheated out of their inheritance, and children couldn't be arbitrarily disinherited by their fathers. These provisions reflected Hammurabi's understanding that a stable society required protecting its most vulnerable members. The implementation of the code was as important as its creation. Hammurabi didn't simply carve his laws in stone and hope for the best. He established a sophisticated administrative system to ensure the laws were enforced consistently throughout his growing empire. He appointed judges who were trained in the code's provisions and held them accountable for fair application of the law. He created appeals processes so that citizens who felt wronged could seek higher review of their cases. The king also understood the importance of publicity in law enforcement. Copies of the code were placed in temples and public squares throughout the empire, and scribes were trained to read and interpret its provisions for illiterate citizens. This transparency was revolutionary. For the first time in human history, ordinary people could know in advance what the legal consequences of their actions would be. The military conquests that spread Hammurabi's influence across Mesopotamia were impressive in their own right. Through a combination of strategic alliances, tactical brilliance, and sheer determination, he transformed Babylon from a minor city-state into the dominant power in the region. He conquered Mari, defeated Assyria, and brought the ancient Sumerian cities under his control. But his greatest conquest wasn't territorial, it was cultural. As Babylonian rule spread, so did Babylonian law. The genius of Hammurabi's approach was that he didn't simply impose his laws on conquered peoples. Instead, he adapted and incorporated local customs where possible, creating a legal framework that felt familiar to diverse populations while establishing consistent principles across his empire. This flexibility helped ensure that his code would survive long after his military victories were forgotten. The influence of Hammurabi's code extended far beyond ancient Babylon. When the Babylonian Empire eventually fell, the legal principles it established continued to influence subsequent civilizations. The Assyrians, who conquered Babylon, adopted many of its legal concepts. The Persians, who built one of history's greatest empires, incorporated Babylonian legal traditions into their own administrative systems. Even the ancient Hebrews, during their Babylonian captivity, were exposed to these legal concepts, and scholars have noted striking similarities between Hammurabi's Code and later biblical law. The rediscovery of Hammurabi's Code in the early 20th century sent shockwaves through the academic world. French archaeologist Jacques de Morgan found the famous stele at Susa in 1901, where it had been taken as a trophy by Elamite raiders over 1,000 years after Hammurabi's death. When scholars finally deciphered the cuneiform text, they realized they were looking at the world's first comprehensive legal code, predating the biblical laws by centuries and providing unprecedented insight into ancient civilization. Modern legal scholars have marveled at the sophistication of Hammurabi's approach to jurisprudence. The code demonstrates an understanding of legal concepts that wouldn't be fully developed in Western law for millennia. The presumption of innocence, the burden of proof, the right to present evidence, and a principle that laws should be applied equally regardless of social status. While the code certainly reflected the values and limitations of its time, its core principles remain remarkably relevant. The economic provisions of the code were particularly advanced, establishing concepts that modern commercial law still recognises. The code addressed contract formation, breach of contract, agency relationships, and even what we might today call bankruptcy proceedings. It established standardized weights and measures, regulated interest rates, and created mechanisms for resolving commercial disputes. These provisions helped create the stable economic environment that allowed Babylon to become one of the ancient world's great commercial centers. Hammurabi's understanding of the relationship between law and social order was profound. He recognized that laws weren't just tools for punishment, but instruments for shaping behavior and building civilization. By making the consequences of actions predictable, he encouraged people to resolve disputes peacefully rather than through violence. By protecting property rights, he encouraged investment and economic development. By establishing clear procedures for everything from marriage to business partnerships, he reduced the uncertainty that bred conflict. The code also reveals Hammurabi's sophisticated understanding of deterrence. The punishments prescribed weren't just about retribution. They were carefully calibrated to discourage specific behaviors. The harsh penalties for theft were designed to protect commerce, while the severe punishments for perjury were meant to preserve the integrity of the legal system itself. Even the famous eye for an eye provisions served a deterrent function, making potential wrongdoers think twice about the consequences of their actions. Perhaps most importantly, Hammurabi established the principle that law should serve justice, not just power. While he certainly used his code to reinforce his own authority, he also bound himself to its provisions. The prologue to the code describes Hammurabi as a shepherd of his people, chosen by the gods to cause justice to prevail in the land, to destroy the wicked and the evil, that the strong might not oppress the weak. This wasn't just royal propaganda. It was a revolutionary concept that would influence legal thinking for millennia. The legacy of Hammurabi's Code extends into the modern era in ways both obvious and subtle. The principle that laws should be written and publicly accessible underlies every modern legal system. The concept of proportional punishment influences contemporary criminal justice. The idea that even rulers should be bound by law forms the foundation of constitutional government. When we speak of due process, equal protection, or the rule of law, we're invoking concepts that Hammurabi helped establish nearly 4,000 years ago. The Code's influence on religious law has been particularly significant. Scholars have noted striking parallels between Hammurabi's provisions and later religious legal codes, including the biblical laws given to Moses. While the relationship between these legal traditions is complex and debated, it's clear that Hammurabi's approach to codifying divine law influenced how subsequent civilizations understood the relationship between religious authority and legal obligation. Even the physical form of Hammurabi's Code has had lasting influence. The idea of carving laws in stone, making them literally permanent and unchangeable, has echoed through history. From the Ten Commandments to the Constitution carved in the walls of the National Archives, the symbolism of law written in stone traces back to that first great stele erected in ancient Babylon. The story of Hammurabi and his code also illustrates the complex relationship between power and justice that continues to challenge societies today. Hammurabi was, by any measure, an absolute monarch who conquered his neighbors and ruled through divine authority. Yet he also created a legal system that limited arbitrary power and protected the weak from the strong. This paradox reminds us that progress often comes from unexpected sources, and that even imperfect systems can establish principles that outlast their creators. The archaeological evidence suggests that Hammurabi's Code was actively used throughout the Babylonian Empire and beyond. Copies have been found across Mesopotamia, and references to its provisions appear in thousands of legal documents from the period. This wasn't just theoretical law, it was practical jurisprudence that governed the daily lives of millions of people. The Code's longevity is testament to its effectiveness. Legal traditions based on Hammurabi's principles continued to influence Mesopotamian law for over 1,000 years after his death. The rediscovery of the Code has also provided invaluable insights into ancient society. Through its provisions, we can understand how ancient Babylonians lived, worked, and related to each other. We learn about their economic systems, their family structures, their religious beliefs, and their social hierarchies. The Code serves as a window into a civilization that laid the foundations for much of human development. Modern legal scholars continue to study Hammurabi's Code not just as a historical curiosity, but as a source of insight into fundamental questions about law and society. How do we balance individual rights with social order? How do we ensure that laws serve justice rather than just power? How do we create legal systems that are both stable and adaptable? These questions that Hammurabi grappled with nearly 4 millennia ago remain central to legal thinking today. The king's approach to legal reform also offers lessons for contemporary lawmakers. Hammurabi didn't create his code in isolation. He consulted widely, studied existing traditions, and adapted his laws to local conditions. He understood that effective law must be both principled and practical, both idealistic and realistic. He recognized that legal systems must evolve gradually, building on existing foundations rather than attempting revolutionary change overnight. The story of Hammurabi also reminds us that individual leaders can have profound and lasting impact on human civilization. While he was certainly a product of his time and culture, his vision and determination created something that transcended both. The principles he established have influenced legal thinking across cultures and millennia, proving that ideas, once unleashed, can have power far beyond their creator's imagination. As we face contemporary challenges in law and governance, Hammurabi's example remains relevant. His understanding that law must serve both order and justice, that it must be both accessible and authoritative, that it must protect both individual rights and social stability, speaks to enduring human needs. The specific provisions of his code may seem archaic, but the principles underlying them remain as vital today as they were in ancient Babylon. The transformation of Babylon under Hammurabi's rule demonstrates the power of legal institutions to shape civilization. Before his reign, Babylon was just another city-state in a chaotic region. After his legal reforms, it became the cultural and commercial center of Mesopotamia, a position it would hold for centuries. This transformation wasn't achieved through military conquest alone, but through the creation of institutions that made peaceful cooperation more profitable than violent conflict. Long before courts and constitutions, one man laid the foundation for law and order. With a hammer and stone, Hammurabi's code wasn't perfect, but it was the beginning. And every time we talk about justice today, his voice still echoes. Subscribe to UTAK Diaries for more stories of forgotten empires, genius minds, and the real roots of civilization.